Aloha. I am Sumi Lee, Associate Professor at UH Hilo, Political Science. Thank you for joining us. Today we are here to discuss South Korea's expanding space program. Although it is about South Korea's space program, I would like to stress that it has a crucial implication for regional and international security, including the US-China rivalry in East Asia. When we think about space, we think about star, shooting star, spaceship, and other scientific phenomena. However, space has become a topic of international security in recent years. South Korea's entry to the space race increases the importance of space in international politics. Therefore, I thought it would be very important that we study South Korea's expanding space program, not only to study its implication for South Korea, but also to come up with constructive implication for regional and international politics. Thanks to generous funding from the Korea Foundation, I was able to invite experts on several issue areas that are likely affected by South Korea's expanding space program. I hope you find this forum informative and helpful. If you haven't paid too much attention to this topic, I hope this forum gets you interested in this very important topic. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down, write them down in the comment box. We will address as many questions or comments as possible. Now, it is my pleasure to present to you one of the founding presidents of the Korean Space Association for National Defense, Dr. Han Bum-jung, who will welcome you to the forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Han Bum-jung of the Korea National Defense University and the president of the Korea Space Association for National Security. I'm very pleased to be holding such a meaningful and interesting academic conference today, graciously hosted by the University of Hawaii at Hilo. It is a welcome event in the sense that an academic conference on the topic of Korea's space power is being held. But it is even more meaningful that such an academic conference is taking place in the United States, outside of Korea. Though the Republic of Korea has made rapid progress in many aspects over the past few decades and is now ranked among one of the most world advanced countries, when it comes to space power, it still remains a developing country. As one of Korea's space scholars, I'm very proud that an international academic conference on the topic of Korea's space power is being held here in Hawaii. As we are well aware, Korea has made rapid progress in space power following the abolition of the ROCKUS missile guidelines in 2021. Through the Artemis Agreement, we have joined the program to go to the moon with many other allies of the United States. Recently, there has been keen interest in the development of space power in Korea. We are entering the new space era even before we have properly gone through the old space era. And the Korean government is also sparing no material and institutional support to develop space power. The status of Korea National Space Council has been raised to the level of the Prime Minister, and space policy centered around the science and technology R&Ds has been adjusted to balance the space security area. As you well know, with the threat of North Korean nuclear development, the progress of space power has become increasingly important in South Korea. In order to respond to the advanced missile capabilities of North Korea and neighboring countries, It is necessary to monitor them in real time and shorten our own response time. The development of Korea's space power will be an opportunity to upgrade the level of the AUKUS alliance. Through Korea's satellite project, both Korea and the United States stand to increase their ability to detect and respond to potential threats in East Asia. The Republic of Korea plans to continue working to strengthen security in and through space. I hope that you will continue to show great interest in Korea's space power development and that these efforts will be realized through the Korean government's policies. I'm very proud today to have the opportunity to discuss Korea's space power with such distinguished scholars, and I would like to especially thank Professor Sumi Lee of the University of Hawaii at Hilo for organizing this conference and Korea Foundation for funding this event. Looking at the presenters, it seems that many experts with worldwide reputations are participating today. I even recognized the names of some scholars who have written books with me at Oxford Press. Once again, hope your presentations will enhance mutual understanding of Korea's space power and contribute to the formation and development of academic communities in this area. Congratulations, and thank you again.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be from anywhere in the world who is watching this forum. Let me begin by thanking Sumi Lee, my co-host, for having me here and for her extraordinary leadership in bringing the rise of South Korea in the international relations of space. I also want to thank the University of Hawaii at Hilo for hosting us, and especially I want to thank the Korea Foundation for its timely support of this project and for giving us an opportunity to think about what the South Korea's rise means in scholarly and policy debates about the new space race. What we're going to do in this forum is to hear from a range of specialists who are bringing historical, institutional, political, geoeconomic, and geostrategic aspects of South Korea's space activities to bear on the rise of South Korea. And alongside China, Japan, India, and North Korea, South Korea has risen rapidly as another determined player that is leveraging its industrial capabilities, its alliances, and network to position itself in the unfolding competition of the new space race. And part of what the forum will try to do today is to have these range of experts give you their points of view of what it means for stability and order in the international relations of space as well. So with that, let me start off the program, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Sumi Lee, who is going to give us an overview of South Korea's space program.
Hello, everybody. In my talk, I will briefly go over the history of South Korea's space program. Before I do that, some of you may wonder why we study about South Korea's space program now. My short answer is it's because it is a hot topic. In spacenews.com, a popular source of news media concerning space, South Korea was mentioned for the first time in an article published on January 10th. Since then, South Korea was mentioned in 619 news articles as of early August 2023. Of 619 news articles, 437 articles were published before May 2021. That is roughly 27 articles per year. 182 articles were published after May 2021. That is about 56 articles per year, more than twice the number of articles that were published before May 2021. May 2021 is an important month in the history of South Korea's space program, which I will talk about in a bit. So these numbers show that something interesting has been happening in South Korea's space program in the past few years. That's why we are studying the subject now. South Korea is considered a latecomer to the space race. It wasn't because the country was not interested in the final frontier. South Korea was interested in space technology as early 1970s. But because the space technology is related to missile technology, South Korea was under certain restriction imposed by the United States, which was worried about South Korea competing with North Korea in the Korean Peninsula. The agreement missile guideline was signed in 1979. Such restrictions include limiting the size of a payload to 500 kilograms and the range to 300 kilometers, and prohibiting the use of solid fuel. Without a doubt, these restrictions held back South Korea for developing and advancing space technology for many years. Revision to the missile guideline were made in 2012, 2020, and finally in May 2021, the missile guideline were terminated, and now South Korea could freely develop space technology, and that's why we are reading a lot about them in news media. Despite all these restrictions, South Korea's space program brought about major achievement. Its first ever satellite was launched in 1992 from France, thanks to South Korea's collaboration with the UK. South Korea's cooperation with Russia led to its first astronaut into space in 2008 and its first satellite with its own launch vehicle, Naro, in 2013. South Korea sent its first satellite developed by its private sector in 2015. South Korea's first military communication satellite was sent in 2020. South Korea joining the Artemis program led by NASA in 2021. In August 2022, last year, South Korea successfully sent a Korean Pathfinder lunar orbiter Danuri. Finally, May 2023, they sent 8 mini satellites into orbit with a homemade rocket, Nuri. I would say, despite all the restrictions the country was under, they could achieve so much within a short period of time, thanks to proactive government policies. South Korea has been releasing a 5 or 10-year space development plan since the 1980s. The most recent one was issued in December 2022. That was last year. It says South Korea aimed to become a powerhouse in space economy by 2045, making up 10% of the global space industry, landing on the moon by 2032 and landing on Mars by 2045. It also talks about strengthening national security capacity in space and ensuring space security. Last, I will talk about South Korea's budget for space development over the years. From 1997 to 2023, the space budget increased from $51 million to $656 million. There was a huge jump from 2005 to 2006, $164 million to $243 million. And it's because of the 2005 Space Development Promotion Act. And South Korea planned to double the space budget in 5 years, which will be over $1.3 billion. By 2045, Korea expects it will spend at least $75 billion. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumi. With that a great overview in mind, we are next going to turn to Scott Snyder from the Council of Foreign Relations, who is going to give us a perspective on the U.S.-South Korea alliance in space security, and particularly the perspective of the United States. So Scott, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sadia, and also thank you to Sumi and University of Hawaii Hilo for holding this project and for the Korea Foundation's support. Sumi has already discussed one of the drivers that I think has really generated a remarkable transformation in terms of the issue of space in the context of the US-South Korea alliance, and that is the development of South Korean capabilities. The key story here is that space has gone from an area where cooperation between the United States and South Korea was blocked to an area that is very actively being pursued. And I think that the three primary drivers for space cooperation also reflect some of the drivers that we have seen as dominant drivers in terms of promoting broader alliance cooperation. South Korean capabilities, the emergence of a focus on China, and also North Korea's continued military development. And so as the alliance has grappled with those issues, US policy has shifted in its approach, recognizing South Korean capabilities, seeing South Korea as a partner in the context of a broader US-China competition, and also continuing to be concerned about North Korea's missile development. There's undeniably a Korean Peninsula competition dynamic there. So as we look at those particular drivers and we see US strategy and policy unfolding, I think there are three main areas where the US and South Korea have been focusing their cooperation over the course of the past decade, since space was first mentioned as an alliance cooperation issue under the Obama administration. And they are peaceful exploration. Sumi, and in the introduction, we talked about South Korea's participation in the Artemis program, their active engagement in the moon exploration and the radar that is being used there. South Korea also is going to be involved in environmental monitoring of the lunar atmosphere as part of future developments. And South Korea is also an active partner in helping in examining maritime domain awareness and also orbital space object awareness. A second area where the US and South Korea are intensifying their cooperation is related to North Korea. And it's really related to intelligence and reconnaissance related to North Korea. And here the key issue is that South Korea's pursuit of their own KPS, Korean Positioning System, will complement the US GPS system, and it will enhance the ability of the US and South Korea to work together in terms of monitoring what North Korea is doing. It will increase the frequency and scope of knowledge as related to North Korean developments. And the third area that I really want to highlight, it's a little bit more complicated area because it involves both competition and cooperation, but it's basically commercial objectives, the development of a commercial space sector. And I think that that is very strongly a motive for South Korea in terms of its own space development program. It is also something that the US is attuned to and interested in. And here I would simply note that South Korean companies are also subcontracting with SpaceX in some areas, and they have aspirations to do more. At present, I think that space is really a win-win area in terms of cooperation within the alliance. There is a pretty big gap in terms of US capabilities versus South Korean capabilities. And as we were talking about the commercial space sector, we're talking about an expanding pie. So there's not any real drivers for competition at this point. And I think that that will remain the case through the near to midterm. So why don't I stop there and we can go on to the other presentations.
Very much for that great overview and for telling us a little bit about what the story looks like with the U.S. Now, to also bring in the perspective from South Korea, I'm going to turn to my colleague, John Fu, who's going to talk
Thank you. First of all, I really thank Dr. Sumi Lee and the Korea Foundation for organizing this wonderful conference event on South Korea's space development. From the start, my research starts from the assumption that this space policy is not just about space technical issues. It revolves around South Korea's overall foreign economic and security policies. So I try to approach these South Korea's space policy and foreign policy related approaches from the perspective of overall South Korea's security policy in the context of rising US-Chinese hegemonic rivalry. Okay, sorry. But the current Yoon Suk-yeol government made a major policy shift in South Korea's policy directions by aligning with the United States and Japan. So sending a clear signal to Beijing that it balances China. So my research addresses why did the current Yoon Suk-yeol government abandon this long-standing strategic ambiguity and join the US-led Indo-Pacific Security and Economic Order, and whether this strategic move a temporary maneuver by the current government or will continue to extend the next government. So to address these questions, I employ neoclassical realism theory of foreign policy to explain how international anarchy and South Korea's power positions in the international system set the parameters of the state's action. And then I come down to domestic politics to examine how domestic individual leaders and general public perceptions about US-Chinese rivalry, and in particular China's role over the Korean Peninsula. So over the past 2 decades, in the context of Sino-Chinese rivalry, South Korea's strategic flexibility has been increasingly limited. At the most broad level, cooperative relations between China and the United States will provide South Korea much room for foreign policy flexibility. Conversely, if the two giants find themselves at odds due to conflicting interests, South Korea will face mounting pressure from both powers, limiting South Korea's policy flexibility. So given this structural context, in domestic areas over the past decade, South Korea's perception about China has turned inherently negative. Typically in South Korean politics, conservatives used to be more negative about China, but in recent years, even progressives in domestic politics of Korea have become very negative to Chinese role in Korean Peninsula. So in my research, I suggest that these negative perceptions about China come from Korea's evaluation about China's role in the Korean Peninsula and greater Asia-Pacific region and China's role in these regions. In particular, South Koreans have a negative perception about China, that China is not a peaceful rival nor a status quo power, but it poses mounting security challenges to South Korea. This perception intensifies in the context of South deployment and enduring Chinese sanctions on South Korea. Second negative perception from Korea is about the perception that China is unable or at least unwilling to assume constructive role in inter-Korean relations and peaceful resolution of North Korean nuclear issues. Recent North Korean missile provocations and China's blocking of UN sanctions resolution strengthen the South Korean perception about Chinese negative role in Korean Peninsula. The third negative perception coming from South Korean leaders and the public is that China has risen as an economic competitor that discriminates South Korean companies in Chinese markets, and also the perception that South Korean economic dependence on China has become a strategic liability and risk factor for Korea. Then the remaining question is whether the current US government trilateral cooperation with the United States and Japan a temporary move, or South Korea returns to previous hedging strategy. At least three factors will contribute to the future of this trilateral cooperation. The first factor is U.S. presidential election from in the year 2024. If the Biden administration continues the leadership, then this trilateral cooperation will continue to grow. But if Trump returns to power, then this trilateral system will be in significant crisis. The second factor that affects this trilateral cooperation will be the obstacles coming from unresolved problems between South Korea and Japan over the historical issues of conflict women and forced labor, as well as the doctor dispute. Given that President Yoon Suk-yeol's approval ratings are one of the lowest among South Korean presidents, these policy issues will bring back confrontation between South Korea and Japan to harm this trilateral cooperation. And third possible factor is, although less likely at this moment, a possible peace offensive move from China and North Korea. If U.S.-China returns to a more cooperative relations, and if United States approach North Korea for peaceful resolution, then South Korea's strategic move will be broadened, and the South Korea's strategic freedom might affect this trilateral cooperation in a very complex way. So I'll stop here and pass the discussion to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Jong-suk. We are now going to turn to Tong-Fy Kim, who is going to talk about what he thinks of as the weakest link, in particular focusing on issues of space security with respect to Japan and South Korea. So Tong-Fy, over to you.
Thank you, Sadia. First, I would like to thank Sumi for organizing this conference and guiding us so smoothly through this project. And I also thank the University of Hawaii for hosting the event and the Korea Foundation for sponsoring the event on this fascinating topic. Now, my topic is US-South Korea-Japan trilateral space cooperation. As China and North Korea are improving their space, nuclear, and missile capabilities, US-South Korea-Japan trilateral space security cooperation is becoming more important to address threats such as missile launches, anti-satellite weapons, and cyber attacks. Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo have had a strong emphasis on space security in recent years. The United States, as the space superpower with over 2/3 of all operational satellites as of the end of 2022, has been concerned about threats from Chinese and Russian weapons against its space assets. The United States established a Space Force in December 2019, making this new entity the first new branch of the armed services since 1947. South Korea had established a Space Operations Unit in 2019, and it was expanded to Space Operations Squadron in December 2022, the same month in which the US Space Force launched in South Korea its first command outside the United States. In addition, as the United States lifted restrictions on South Korea's missile development in 2021, Seoul has been accelerating the development of space rockets, which are technologically similar to ballistic missiles. And for this reason, the space development for South Korea had a sort of a handicap in the past. Japan is also currently undergoing efforts for stronger space security capabilities. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force will be renamed to Japan Air and Space Self-Defense Force by the fiscal year 2027-2028. And in the years between fiscal years 2023 and 2027, Japan's defense ministry's space-related budget is expected to increase 5 times to around 1.5 trillion yen. Fortunately for these 3 states' individual interests in space security, there is now a good environment for trilateral space cooperation because of the improvement in the bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan, which is traditionally the weakest link in the trilateral relations. Starting in 1994, there have been 13 US-South Korea-Japan trilateral summit meetings. 4 of these 13 meetings took place under the current South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. And the last meeting at Camp David was the first ever standalone trilateral summit because the previous 12 meetings were always on the sidelines of multilateral meetings. Although President Yoon was only a year and 3 months into his 5-year term at the time of the Camp David summit meeting, his attendance record of 4 trilateral summits was already twice the number for any previous South Korean president. And by the time he finishes his term, he will be so many more beyond the previous record. The strategic interests of the 3 countries are conducive to space cooperation, and space cooperation in turn is a promising path for strengthening trilateral cooperation. US-South Korea-Japan trilateral security cooperation has traditionally focused on the threat from North Korea, but the scope of this cooperation has expanded in the context of competition between the United States and China's increasing assertiveness toward Japan, and to a lesser extent to South Korea. And even a geographically remote event like Russia's war against Ukraine indirectly affected South Korea by shaping North Korea's nuclear weapons policy since last year. US extended deterrence that protects South Korea and Japan heavily depends on US space assets, and the United States is also eager to get support of its allies in its competition against China. All these factors point to the need for stronger trilateral security cooperation, especially in a way that is durable against future shocks from domestic politics of the 3 states, but in particular South Korea and the United States. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tongfi. That was a great overview. And continuing on the theme of thinking about durable cooperation, I'm so pleased to turn to Christy Govella, who is going to tell us a little bit about how South Korea is strategizing in the context of regional institutions, particularly those led by China and Japan. So, Christy, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today, and I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking the University of Hawaii at Hilo for hosting and the Korea Foundation for their support of this really important project. So as we've been discussing, South Korea's space program has been growing, which presents opportunities for it to think about how it's going to engage more broadly in space diplomacy. So in my research for this project, I focus on looking at engagement with Asian regional institutions, which has very much been shaped by the geopolitical factors such as those that my colleagues have been talking about. So what factors have shaped South Korea's evolving institutional strategies, And how is South Korea engaging with the existing and emerging regional institutional architecture of space cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? In my research, I find that South Korea's institutional strategies have very much been influenced by economic, security, and institutional factors. In economics, the most advantageous institutions offer opportunities to strengthen domestic industry, to build capacity, and to cultivate market opportunities. In security, the most advantageous institutions offer opportunities to strengthen partnerships or military alliances and pursue desirable dual-use technologies. And in terms of institutional factors, often the structure of rules or decision-making structures or institutional activities offer a different mix of benefits for countries that want to participate. So I look at engagement with 5 different institutions, 4 that are well established and 1 set of minilaterals that is now emerging. And I find that South Korea's engagement has really been strongest in the Japan-led Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, which presents South Korea with opportunities for its government and private sector actors to strengthen their relationships with U.S. allies and partners, with others across a wide swath of Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. So the informal and flexible nature of the grouping gives South Korean actors control over the nature and the amount of their engagement, which offers a great deal of strategic flexibility. And the institutional structure of annual meetings and working groups Are we back?
We are back.
Okay. So in contrast, South Korea has not joined the China-led Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization because it doesn't align with any of the factors I just mentioned. So it does offer some potential economic benefits due to its focus on joint projects and fair return, but it also presents a number of concerns related to Chinese leadership of the organization, as well as some risks related to potential proliferation concerns, since China is not a member of MTCR. And this has been something of a concern in the past and has been met with U.S. opposition in past cases where South Korea has attempted to cooperate with China in space. And institutionally, because it is an institution with hard rules and more formal structure, if South Korea were to join, it would lock it in a strategic way. So that would be a higher barrier for its participation. I also look at 2 regional centers for space science and technology education in the Asia Pacific, one that's led by India and one that's led by China. And these are essentially educational institutions for building space capacity in the region. South Korea is represented on the governing board of the India-led organization, but its participation has been relatively limited in the past 25 years, and it's not participated at all in the China-led organization. And I think that really is due to a not very good fit with some of the benefits that I mentioned earlier. So finally, turning to what's emerging in the region, I look at the potential for South Korea to participate in emerging mini dialogues, such as the trilateral that was just discussed between Japan, South Korea, and the US. And South Korea has demonstrated interest in discussing space in these configurations. And I think that's because they do align very well with these economic, security, and institutional factors. In terms of security, they are mostly engaging US allies and partners. Economically, offers South Korea the opportunity to engage with countries who are relatively developed space capabilities. And the minilateral structure offers maximum institutional flexibility. So those are all benefits. So just to conclude with a few implications, I think that it's important to look at these issues of space diplomacy because it really shifts the focus from how major powers are competing in the space domain to looking at how middle powers like South Korea or smaller powers can navigate institutional options and geopolitics and build stronger connections with other countries if they wish to do so. And I think that as divisions deepen and economic and security policies become more intertwined in the future, we're going to see just deepening of the trends I mentioned, with South Korea probably wanting to deepen engagement with more US aligned institutions and probably continuing to avoid the riskier ones. But thinking about this kind of question of space diplomacy is an important part of the equation as South Korea thinks about its expanding space program. It's not just about the commercial opportunities or the security interests, but also how to use space to shape its broader relationships around the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Christy. And now we are going to turn to Won-jae Hwang, who is going to tell us a little bit about South Korea's geoeconomic strategy and what that might look like with respect to the space domain. So Won-jae, over to you.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate Professor Sumi Lee and University of Hawaii and Korean Foundation for this wonderful opportunity to join this exciting project. In my paper, I examine South Korea's geo-economic strategy in space. Largely speaking, there are three forces in South Korea's geo-economic strategy. The first one is public-private partnership, PPP. It seems that South Korean government understands that they cannot achieve their goal without working with the private sector. So regarding this PPP, it seems that they have three specific plans in its PPP strategies. First one is to build strong governing structure in space industries. It seems that the many politicians and elite groups in South Korea strongly believe in the argument on the developmental state. That is, to develop a certain strategic industry, government need to take a leadership by actively planning and managing and controlling, regulating private sector with massive investment. So to this end, inconsistent with this idea, the Korean government has created and taken a leadership role and created a lot of strong governing structures. For example, they built the National Space Committee in 2005, which is the highest advisory committee to the president. And in this committee, it consists of ministers and vice ministers from 11 different ministries. And even since November 2022, now the president is taking the chairship role in this committee and overviewing and all these issues and plan and necessary to develop the space industry. So basically, this is the control tower in this governing structure. They built it in 2005, and recently now they try to build so-called CASA, is the Korean version of NASA. They try to create this executive office of this National Space Committee, and they plan to launch this CASA next year. Once it starts, this CASA will enjoy absolute power and mobilize lots of resources and control many belonging agencies and make a connection to the university, institutions, and international cooperation of other countries. So that's the first specific plan for these under these PPP strategies. And second one is to promote collaboration with the selective private partners. So to this end, they have created institutional frameworks through which they can invite and work together with the private sectors. And also to choose certain groups of private sector, they selectively choose their partners. So to this end, they have utilized mixed, for example, many different methods, including the mixed R&D method. I can talk about it later more. But anyway, they selectively choose because they understand that their resources is quite limited. So they choose only selectively a few private partners and concentrate all their resources to these selected private partners. The third specific plan under this PPP is massive investments, concentrations of their resources, even transfer of technology they have accumulated in the past, like KASI, for example, Korean Aerospace Research Institute, as a public firm, they have accumulated a lot of information technology in the satellite and launching vehicle technology. Now they try to transfer this technology to certain private firms like Hanwha Aerospace. The second focus in this government geoeconomic strategy is to join U.S. effort to build resilient global supply chain. So, for example, the South Korean government last year made a commitment to join Triple Alliance. By joining U.S. side, now Korea declared that we will work with the U.S. in this power competition with China. South Korea has an advantage in space industry in terms of space designing, space components like semiconductors, and Earth observing and monitoring kind of. In that area, Korea has strong strengths and then they can contribute to the U.S. effort in these technology competitions against China. And the third, their focus in these geoeconomic strategies is to promote international cooperation beyond the U.S. Now South Korea try to reach out as many as possible other countries like the EU or India, UAE, Australia. They try to build this diversified international network as much as possible. That's their third focus in geostrategic in space. South Korea also have, because of this, their strategy, they are facing some challenges. The first one is China factor. They cannot lose for South Korea. They cannot lose China. China is too close to lose for South Korea, for many regions. But the Indo-Pacific strategy is now the U.S. promoting. In that strategy, they're obviously targeting China. But for South Korean perspective, they cannot lose China. So how to make a deal with the U.S. regarding to dealing with China will be a big challenge for South Korea, even in space industry. The second factor challenges they will face is friction in between U.S. and South Korea. Some of their firms, even in space industry, actually in competition each other. For example, Hana Aerospace versus SpaceX actually are in competitions. When they do two sides realize that actually their own private firms are in competition, how deep they can go in their cooperation could be a big challenge and question for these two countries. The last one is the domestic factor, domestic politics. By nature, the space industry requires long-term commitment and massive investment. Therefore, South Korea, beyond their all differences, different parties and different groups of politicians, they need to unite and work together. Whether they can make a long-term commitment, consistent and continuous effort to develop space industry, whether they can make it happen could be a big challenge for the South Korea. Also internationally, now the South Korea, Japan, US working together in trilateral cooperations. It seems like they are happy with this cooperation right now, but when they realize that, and the public opinion change, when they realize that they see some differences with, especially Japan, in terms of like shared value. When they realize that they don't share similar value, only similar shared interest, they can cause big problem to government to join and work with US and Japan. That's the third challenges now South Korea need to resolve and address in the near future. That's it. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for that also. And thank you to all of my colleagues for giving us such a great overview of the ways that South Korea has risen in the international relations of space and what some of the challenges and opportunities are for the South Korean state to engage in this area. So as you can hear from all these talks, the idea that South Korea is trying to position in the new space race does not really quite make much sense without some understanding of the study and practice of the international relations of Asia as a whole. The regional space politics are not divorced from the economic and political trends that are also broadly shaping prospects for all countries in this region. China, Japan, India, North Korea, and South Korea have, of course, long been key to the dynamics of the international relations of Asia, and they are also going to be pivotal to the way that, in terms of shaping the international relations of space. So in conclusion, rather than simply repeating what my colleagues have put out so brilliantly, what I'd like to do is to step back and talk a little bit about how South Korea, as well as Asia more broadly, fits into what we think of as the new space race. And this is a very, very important time to do so because we're at a very, very historic moment in the new space race, and there are many elements that are stressing the prospects of interstate stability as well as peace and order in this particular domain. There are many more new states. There are many unprecedented commercial technologies, and there's also, of course, a slide towards weaponization in the context of great power. And these were all the things that my colleagues have put for us on the table. So to sort of round things out, what I'm going to do is to put for you to consider 6 themes that we are taking away from this particular symposium. And the first of these themes, as we see it, is that the gravity of the international relations of space has really shifted to Asia. Asia leads all other regions of the world with the highest concentration of independent and autonomous sovereign states: China, Japan, India, South Korea, North Korea, who possess some of the most advanced capabilities for civilian, commercial, and military space. And of course, they are not, as you heard, acting in unison, but they're also guided by their own national imperatives. Along with these more dominant players, we also have to keep an eye out for countries like Australia and New Zealand, as well as a wide variety of states in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia, who are also attempting to enter the space race. A second theme that I think we see emerging is that the state in Asia will be a very prime decision-making locus for shaping the nature of space activities. So consistent with the state-centric reality of what we think of as the international relations of Asia, both the top and emerging spacefaring powers in Asia are trying to balance the economic and political trends, and they're doing so in line with their own political and economic interests. South Korea, in this sense, is not different from all the other powers that are trying to do exactly the same. These are countries that, of course, will not be dictated to, given where they are, but they can certainly be persuaded through bargaining and communication. A third theme that I think emerges from the symposium is that dual-use space technology offers another pathway to wealth and security for Asian states. So there will be competition over acquiring and indigenizing space technology, whether through direct or indirect means, for all Asian states to advance their own prosperity and security. This is, of course, very consistent with a very strong historical intellectual lineage in the region about staying abreast of strategic high-tech sectors that crisscross civilian and military benefits and that promise to pull others along. I would also add, just in terms of technologies, that the intersection of the space domain with other emerging and disruptive technology frontiers, AI, quantum, cyber, is, I think, very important for all the states, including, of course, South Korea. A fourth theme that we see emerging here is that new patterns of complex interdependence may stay the hand of conflict in the space domain. So continued economic integration, trade and investment flows, resilient supply chains, all sort of underpin prospects for continued engagement among all these regional players. So disrupting these flows is of concern to the players in the region, as in the US bid to secure supply chains for semiconductors around the world. Another point that emerges in terms of complex interdependence is that regional institutions that formally and informally govern relations among these countries through so many different ways do affect the prospects for engagements and information exchanges among all these states. I would add, though, that they do not diminish the space nationalism that drives the principal spacefaring states to compete with others in and out of the region. A fifth theme that emerges from this symposium is that US-led alliances in Asia are at the forefront of transforming into space alliances. And some of this is historically now beginning to go into place, as you heard from the symposium presenters today. Of course, security institutions in Asia are important for continued dialogue in the region and for socializing all kinds of emerging players into the realities of the new space race. But because of the designation of space as a war-fighting domain and of the US declaration of the need to protect command and control structures that underpin extended deterrence, this has really put US-led alliances with Japan and South Korea at the center of transformation into space alliances. This may also bring into effect the long-standing hub-and-spoke model, with the spokes also potentially strengthening their relations in the distant future. Final point that I would just put out there for people to consider, particularly from the forum, is that Asian states will be pivotal to shaping or scuttling prospects for peace and order in outer space. Of course, the capabilities of Asian states make them ideal candidates for large-scale collaboration in space as well as on the moon and beyond. And diplomatically, there is no question that they're being courted in the bipolar space competition between the US and China. The rules on which they all operate and who gets to write and interpret them will really matters for prospects for peace and order in the years ahead. So thank you very much for listening. We are going to take a short break and we will be back at about 3:10. In the meantime, you are going to see a video that we are going to run, and I hope that you will send us questions to which we can provide answers from. If you have a particular question to one of the speakers, please go ahead and address them to that person as well. We'll see you very shortly for the Q&A session. Thank you for joining us again. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to engage in a question and answer session. We have some questions gathered from our audience, and I thought that we would begin with something general. If anybody wants to weigh in on this question, I think it would be very helpful. The question is, I think any one of you can certainly weigh in on this, but what are some of the factors that can slow down the South Korea space development? What are some of the factors that can slow down South Korea's space development, and that can therefore have an impact on prospects of collaboration, competition, and so on, as you have actually described? Does anybody, Scott, do you want to take that question? Maybe just we'll start with the conversation.
I just want to get us started because, I mean, Sumi is talking about, I think, a major catalyst rather than a restraint, but it could become a restraint in the future, and that is budget. You know, the fact that the South Korean government is committing a significant investment in the sector, I think, is one of the drivers. Another possible, you know, question that I think has been hinted at throughout the presentations is, does space enjoy a domestic public consensus in South Korea? Actually, I'm a little bit more sanguine than some of the comments that were made by some of the other participants about the domestic dimension as related to space, primarily because I think that South Koreans really enjoy their image as early adapters and technology early adapters. And I think that extends to the space dimension, but I'm prepared to hear the counter arguments from other colleagues.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that issue? While you were thinking about this, one thing that I would put on the table for us all to consider, another constraint is, I think, what is the horizon that you're thinking about, the time frame that you're thinking about in terms of making profits? Because one of the most important things that we're talking about in this new space race is that it is commercial, that it has unprecedented technologies, that everybody wants to position in its niches. But this space is a very hazardous and very, very difficult business. And it's only recently that SpaceX has announced that it's made about, $55 million of profits after roughly a 20-year period of being in the game. So I think that from the commercial standpoint, and perhaps also from returns on taxpayers' dollars standpoint, that may also be an important constraint when we think about what might affect continued interest in this. I was always curious about, please, Christy, I see your hand is up. Yeah.
Just to chime in on this question, I think that I'd echo what Scott said about domestic politics, but I think not just thinking about the domestic politics of South Korea, but also the domestic politics of other potential partners around the region. I think that also is a factor, because I think right now there's a lot of energy and excitement, but we've seen, for example, recently in Australia that the new government has sort of stepped away from some of the enthusiasm that the previous administration had for space cooperation. So I think that also may have, an effect, just seeing how some of these like-minded partners may have more or less of an appetite. And we all know that domestic politics can be quite contentious in many of the countries around the region.
Yeah. And as we also heard already about South Korea domestically, there may also be differences between different parties as they rotate in and out of power. Do you see that, for those of you who were examining that a little bit more closely, as a constraint or a facilitator of where this trend might go in South Korea? Please.
That issue a little bit. At first glance, many people simply think that
there's a partisan division over South Korea's foreign policy priorities. For example, the Conservative Party, including the current ruling People's Power Party, and the current President Yoon Suk-yeol those conservatives pursue mostly pro-U.S. policy while imposing adversarial stance towards North Korea and to a lesser extent to China. And on the other hand, progressive parties are like balancers or hedging strategy, a political group that tries to balance between U.S.-China rivalry. But if we look at the past 2 decades of foreign policy practices by South Korea, those partisan differences do not actually make much difference because, for example, 1998 through 2008, the progressive governments by Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, they at first tried to balance between the United States and China, but in the end, they ended up being a pro-American administrations. And also conservative governments by Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye from 2008 to 2017, they came to power with a pledge that they are going to restore and strengthen security alliance with the United States. But those 2 conservative governments at the same time expanded South Korea's cooperation with China. So ultimately, there is a big gap between those political parties' policy priorities and actual policy outcomes. So we can say that it is largely because of the international structural factors actually constrain South Korea's policy direction, especially in the context of this intensifying U.S.-Chinese confrontation. And I think the current trilateral cooperation, South Korea's cooperation with the United States and China and Japan, is not likely to return to previous hedging strategy. This trilateral cooperation will continue, but there are some risk factors in this trilateral cooperation, as I discussed in detail in my paper. It's largely because in the past several decades, the United States has tried really hard to create this trilateral cooperation, but the United States failed because South Korea and Japan had their own unresolved historical issues. And now the current Biden administration brought together those 3 powers for coalition, but without resolving those historical issues between 2 Asian allies. So if these unresolved historical issues return to South Korean domestic politics and South Korean domestic political opinion, public opinion turns highly negative about Japan, then it will significantly weaken South Korean government policy move to cooperate further. And second possible negative factor coming from South Korean domestic politics is South Korean public's perception that South Korea cooperated too much with the United States and give too much to Japan and US side while losing much from China side. And then if South Koreans believe that the United States did not give enough to South Korea, then there will be a kind of voice of grievance in South Korea and voice for returning to the previous hedging strategy. But overall, as long as this US-Chinese confrontation and competition continues to intensify, then South Korean policy leverage will be severely limited and end up staying in this trilateral cooperation. That's my pretty much assessment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jong-suk. I think that makes a lot of sense. And to that, we should also add that in this region, as with every other region, particularly perhaps in the space domain, states are very watchful of their defense industrial base. And we should also remember that, at the end of the day, there are commercial actors that are involved in competition with each other. So I was wondering, Won-jae, if you could comment a little bit about whether or not that also, how does that also affect the possibilities of continued cooperation between the US and Japan and other actors?
Thank you. My opinion is pretty much consistent with what just Professor said. one of the issues in the relationship between in the cooperative relationship between South Korea and the U.S. we may see is, again, as you just mentioned, the potential conflict and competitions between private firms in each side is possible. Right now, we don't see, because there are big technology gap between, for example, Hana Aerospace and the SpaceX. But by nature, the space industry, high-tech industry, where in this high-tech industry, the winner will take most of the share, the pie. So if Hana Aerospace, because Korean government trying to invest like $26 billion in the next several years to make sure that their own firm, Hana Aerospace, to grow up to compete against SpaceX. That's their plan. So Hana Aerospace tried to build a launching vehicle which is equivalent and can compete against SpaceX in the future. But when actually Hana Aerospace gained these capabilities, then U.S. government need to think about the situation carefully, whether they want to work with the South Korea and whether they want to take care of their own firms. And same thing for the South Korean government. So right now, because there's big technology gap and because of the U.S.-China competitions, they pay little attention to this issue. But definitely there is a growing concerns about the potential conflict come these two sides. For example, the current launching cost per kilogram for the launching vehicle Nuri made by the Hana Aerospace is about $32,000, while SpaceX, the launching cost per kilogram for their own launching vehicle is only $2,000. So it'll take a long time for South Korean firms to catch up with the SpaceX. But when they narrow down those gaps, now the issue will actually arise, and then the two government, two sides, we have to deal with these issues. So we have to be aware of these issues. It may be coming. And we already see these issues in the semiconductor industry, like Samsung, SK Hynix, and Intel in the US, and Sony in Japan are in competition, and Samsung and the SK Hynix, the companies are complaining about the US restricting this export control in China. And they believe US taking care of their own firms too much and sacrificing the South Korean firms.
Yeah, I think that is very well put. And I think it raises a number of other issues, not just the issue of how these arrangements will be politically worked out between the countries that are centrally involved and that have these important commercial actors. But another question that it raises, and I'm wondering if anybody wants to take this on, is that when we think about the United States, we know that it is the predominant, one of the predominant sort of player in the space domain, no matter what angle you're looking at it. And why would the United States want to cooperate with South Korea or Japan or any other Asian country on space security, given that it is so much ahead? Like, what are the incentives that are involved? If anybody would like to take on that question, I think that is a question that's really worth addressing. Tongfi, I see your hand is up, so please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Sadia.
Yeah.
So indeed, the United States is so much ahead of others, possibly China catching up. But in terms of other U.S. partners like South Korea or Japan, the United States clearly has such a big advantage. And when it comes to commercial competition, that kind of big advantage may be actually good because the US side doesn't feel threatened. And maybe there's enough room for coexistence of space policy that focus on different aspects, maybe based on the different levels of space technological development. In terms of security interests, I think one thing that is really interesting about space security is that when we talk about military security, usually, and when we talk about deterrence on Earth, we usually assume that the most likely targets of aggression are the allies of the United States, because few countries would actually dare to directly attack the United States. But when it comes to space, because the United States has so much more satellites in space, and also because the United States and its allies security depends so much on U.S. space assets. Actually, it is the United States that is facing a lot of threats in space. So that creates incentives for the United States to gather whatever help it can get from the allies. And obviously, this is also very important when it comes to financial support from the allies, but also in certain technological areas like semiconductors. South Korea can really make a big difference. And then also because China is perceived to be catching up with the United States in space capabilities, I think that puts pressure on Washington, and the United States is therefore eager to increase space cooperation with its allies. And there was, I think, probably quite a bit of a desire to control the space policy of the allies in the past. But because of the increase in geopolitical competition between the United States and China, I think the United States is now much more genuinely interested in facilitating the development of space capabilities of its allies, and actually really having solidarity against the rising power in space, which is China.
That is great. It leads to two sets of questions, I think. One about the internal politics in the U.S., and Scott, I'll come back to you on that in just a second. But let me also turn to Christy a little bit about the prospect for continued regional cooperation as it is going into place, and as it is. And in your own paper, you had discussed how South Korea is actually attempting to strategize in the context of these regional institutions. What do you see as the prospects of that as the geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China continues to go into place? That's the first thing. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you is that some of our collaborators have also put forth the idea that China might itself, it's not just a passive actor, it may also engage in sort of a peace offensive that may incentivize countries to engage in different ways with respect to cooperation. So maybe tell us a little bit about where you see regional cooperation going, and in the context of the great power competition, and whether you foresee that South Korea might strategize differently in case China does reach out.
So that's a very interesting and complicated question. I think one thing that struck me when I was looking at the structure of existing and emerging regional institutions is how essentially at the moment, economic and security factors are really pushing South Korea in the same direction. So they're not conflicting. The economic benefits are really lining up along with its security interests. And if you know about space, perhaps that isn't surprising, because economics and security are strongly linked in the space domain in terms of policy, in terms of technology, et cetera. So I think that it is possible that, China could mount some kind of a diplomatic offensive and try to strengthen its ties, but there are also barriers concretely in cooperation that has direct security implications. So I think that will be a challenge for it continually. And as divisions deepen, as I mentioned briefly in my presentation, I think that it will make the choice between the two, it will make the upsides bigger and the downsides riskier in some sense. So in some sense, I see the divisions as being sort of mutually self-reinforcing, although certainly China could make some headway in some areas. The security implications of space technology and space cooperation really do make U.S. allies and partners think seriously about their options.
So, Christy, just to follow up on that, do you think that You're a person who really knows the landscape of regional cooperation institutions so well. I wanted to ask you, looking forward, do you see any possibility of the creation of new kinds of venues or forums for space cooperation? Can South Korea be a part of that going forward?
So I think I would also welcome Tongfi's thoughts on the trilateral cooperation on this,
Yeah.
but I think that the most momentum is really at this minilateral level in these small formats. And I think that's not just in space, that's in other kinds of cooperation generally. I think that there's a sense that in small groups of like-minded countries, that's where the most progress can be made and where the most momentum can be built. And we see this routinely, again, not just in space, but in other areas of cooperation. So I think that that's probably where the most potential lies. I think the trilateral dialogue that people have talked about definitely has its potential pitfalls and challenges moving ahead, but there is also a lot of promise for cooperation. I think also if we are talking about countries other than South Korea, there's a space working group, for example, in the Quad that has been doing a lot of talking. I think that a lot of that is kind of unevenly matched in terms of cooperation among Quad countries, but it is interesting that South Korea has been deepening its cooperation with Australia, with India, for example. So I think that that kind of small cooperation in terms of minilateral formats is probably the area where we'll see the most momentum and the most institution building, if at a small level.
Yeah. A wonderful answer. So, Tongfi, I wonder if you can also sort of pick up on that, because you are dealing with the weakest link in this, what we're thinking of as a tripolar cooperation scheme, attempting to emerge under the leadership of the U.S. But more concretely, with respect to South Korea and Japan, are there some ways or some forms or institutional formats that you think would be conducive to sort of building cooperation, particularly in a domain that, as we've sort of learned, has both economic and then also security connotations?
Thank you. First, I agree with Christy that minilateral formats are probably the most promising path, simply because the more participants you have, the more problems you usually get. And technically speaking, even minilateral formats often already have these problems. I mean, Quad, for example, often had problems because of India's sensitivity to, not to provoke China too much. And when it comes to the US, South Korea, Japan trilateral relations, yes, only 3 actors, but because of the weakest link, because of the traditional animosity between Japan and South Korea, even 3 actors was difficult to coordinate. So if it becomes a multilateral arrangement, I think it'll inevitably become a sort of a diluted form of cooperation, and it'll be difficult to achieve something deep, especially in a quick manner. So where it really matters, I think minilateral format would be a lot easier to start, and also, you can also go much deeper. And when it comes to the trilateral cooperation, I've been looking at the US, South Korea, Japan trilateral relations. Actually, I think before the current South Korean administration began, a lot of people would have been very skeptical about this trilateral format as well. And even after the Yoon Suk-yeol administration began, I think the Japanese side was actually quite skeptical, because as Jong-suk was saying as well, I think even conservative South Korean presidents have had, we have certain ideas about the correlation. So the conservative governments being more pro-American and more conciliatory toward Japan, and progressive liberal government being more conciliatory toward North Korea and China and so on. But in reality, I think many South Korean conservative presidents also had a lot of issues with Japan. So at the moment, I think the Japan-South Korea relation is sort of in a exceptional stage, and part of that is probably the preference of the of President Yoon and his foreign policy team.
Mhm.
And part of that is the really negative public image of China in South
Mhm.
Korea. And by the way, I don't know research on the causal relationship, but generally speaking, from what I have seen in terms of public opinion data, I think the South Korean views on Japan and China, they have sort of a negative correlation. So
Mhm.
I think the positive relationship between South Korea and Japan probably became more likely because of the negative turn of this image of China in South Korea because of the third dispute. And I haven't read this article yet, but I also saw on Asian Survey that there's a new article showing how the COVID, the pandemic, also affected the South Korean public's image of China. So there are many of these factors that have contributed to the negative image of China in South Korea and less negative image of Japan in South Korea. And now this trilateral cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, it has a really rare moment of opportunity. And I think space cooperation is really a promising path for the three actors to pursue because first, the three of them doing this together, especially when it comes to the South Korea-Japan bilateral relations, I think it's important to have the United States engaged because this way, Seoul or Tokyo cannot unilaterally just withdraw from the cooperation because that will also offend Washington and that these allies don't want to do. So that trilateral format is already good. And space cooperation, because of its dual-use nature and so on, it's not just important for security, but also commercial interests. A lot of ministries are involved. Many bureaucrats are involved. They will spend a lot of time working on these projects. They don't want to see these initiatives to just go to the garbage bin just because a president comes into power in Seoul or in Washington, D.C. So I think it's very important to have these diverse actors having some stakes in the trilateral cooperation. And I think space cooperation is really an ideal issue area for this kind of institutionalization and bringing diverse actors as stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder also that bureaucratic momentum might also build stakeholders with interest in sort of taking forward that cooperation. And that sort of brings me back to the US a little bit, Tongfi, because you have raised the issue of the US in this context. And Scott, let me ask you a question particularly about talking about cooperation between allies is easy, but there are lots of domestic stumbling blocks in the US that have traditionally sort of hampered the possibilities of this dual-use technology. In particular, ITAR, as you know, there's been a lot of concerns about security and proliferation concerns and the role that it plays in the space industry as well. So if you can tell us a little bit about whether you see changes there, whether the US can sort of talking about building concrete projects for space cooperation, whether you see some softening in that very important regulatory mechanism in the United States.
Well, I'll make a few broad comments. I actually think, Sadia, that you've asked a question that you're better suited to answer than me. But also I have to point out, even though I've actually said the least about South Korea, about the U.S. domestic political environment, it's been a theme that Won-jae and Jong-suk and Tongfi have all been touching on. I think I touched on it actually the least, but I think that we have to recognize that all of our presentations are deeply rooted in a particular moment and focused on the promise of functional cooperation in the context of a Biden administration that has restored normality to U.S. foreign policy to a significant degree. And so what that means is that any domestic political developments that result in a shift away from that conventionality or normality is going to carry a lot of costs. And I think that, what has been interesting about the conversation overall is that everybody has alluded to those. And now I'm going to be the one who just tries to put it front and center by asking maybe a series of rhetorical questions. The U.S. is engaging in industrial policy for the first time, really, in a long time, and trying to harness up with allies who have a lot deeper experience with industrial policy. So how do we expect to be able to do that very, effectively? The Biden administration is very strongly behind this minilateral framing, which was not present during the Trump administration. That's an area where we've seen dramatic shift in terms of means, whereas there have been some continuities with regards to ends as related to China. And so, what that ends up looking like and whether it can be sustained in a future administration is interesting. And then finally, I think Jong Suk put his finger on it very politely and indirectly. The Yoon administration has made the U.S. so central in South Korea's foreign policy that if the U.S. shifts its foreign policy, that could have dramatic implications for Korean perceptions of the United States. So I think that all of the question that you ask, I actually think that everybody else has had pieces of this and it's there. And so I'm just trying to draw it out and make it a little bit more explicit.
I think that I think that you've sort of hit the problem on the head. I mean, the U.S., the domestic politics, as we've heard from all the speakers here, is extremely important. But for the hub, perhaps the domestic politics is very important in the context of alliances and cooperation in the space domain. So in response to Scott's thing, I wonder if you can all sort of respond to this issue of how the possibility of the U.S. shifting its position, whether for electoral reasons or for other reasons, sort of has a bearing on the possibilities of cooperation in the space domain. Does anybody want to take that on? Jong Suk, I think that Scott sort of pointed out something that you were saying. I wonder if you can take the floor and maybe talk about this as well.
Yes, I think in Korean politics, foreign policy issues are highly politicized. And even though I have not been direct.
Jong Suk, you're muted. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, just start again.
Yeah, at least in the context of South Korean politics, foreign policy issues have been highly politicized in almost all elections in South Korea. And even though I didn't see any serious research article about the correlation, but the most recent presidential election was held in the context of rising SARS, the high point of SARS sanction, and then at the height of COVID-19. Those two issues actually brought very strong negative image about China among South Koreans, and I think if President Yoon actively mobilized that anti-China position among South Koreans, and I think even though he won the election by narrow margin, but I think he benefits from this anti-China perspective. But I think still, I mean, as Scott mentioned, same political impact might come from U.S. domestic politics to South Korea, because as I said, if South Koreans evaluate that Yoon Suk-yeol president, the administration gave so much to U.S. and Japan side without no return, and then if the next different administration comes from the United States and try to adopt maybe unilateral or America first policy, trying to sacrifice its allies' economic and security interests, it might it will bring significant domestic political impact to South Korea, and it will actually severely harm the South Korean government leaders' initiative in this space policy cooperation with the United States and Japan. I think mostly those domestic political issues will be the main driving and harming factors for this trilateral cooperation in the future.
Interesting. Very interesting. Christy, Longjae, did you want to comment on this particular issue as well, with respect to what is going on in the U.S. and expectations about politics in the U.S. and how that might be affecting the prospects for cooperation or not?
Okay, well, from my understanding, many politicians in South Korea and even the public perception toward the U.S. and U.S. effort to build a resilient global supply chain is that they feel like U.S. doesn't matter who is the leaders in the U.S. and it doesn't matter the political differences in the domestic in the U.S. They feel like the U.S. now focusing more on their own self-interest. So actually, that's how they feel about the Biden administrations. So we are talking about shared value and shared interest. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a growing concern inside South Korea and among public and also politicians that the U.S. focusing too much on their interest, their value, instead of shared interest. For example, although again, UN organizations announced that they will join U.S. side in Chip4 and also Indo-Pacific strategies, they still showed a lot of hesitation taking side with the U.S. and eliminating and they're cutting their tie or losing their tie with China because China, again, is too important for South Korea to lose. Like for example, semiconductor export to the world, like to the South Korea, it takes about 60% of their GDP. And 60% of their semiconductor export goes to China and Hong Kong. So if they have to cut the tie or lose tie with China in terms of semiconductor export, which is also a key component of the space or satellite industry, then we are talking about losing about 3 to 4% of their GDP. South Korea cannot sustain and take it. So they have to have China as an economic partner. So if U.S. needs to understand South Korean problem, it seems like the U.S. doesn't understand this too much. Of course, we share similar value on many issues. But in terms of economic issue, it's about to survive the national economy. So South Korean, the publics and the politicians strongly argue the U.S., the government, the politicians, doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, need to understand situations of South Korea. And then if they force South Korea to move more close to the U.S. side by cutting or losing their tie with China in terms of economic tie, then I'm not sure there's repercussion and backlash inside the domestic party in South Korea. They may say that we need to reconsider our action toward the U.S. and their Indo-Pacific strategies. That's my concerns.
Very interesting. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this? Scott, I see your hand there, please. Scott, you're muted, so just... Yeah.
I mean, Longjae makes a very powerful argument as related to interdependence between China and South Korea, but I would actually make a slightly different argument that I think is one of the byproducts of the U.S. decision to essentially pursue a policy of securitization of technology. And that is that it comes with a little bit of a kind of obligation for the U.S. to provide some replacement for South Korea in the semiconductor sector. And I think the way that that is envisioned to play out is actually through South Korean investment in the United States, at least in cutting edge semiconductor technologies, with the legacy technologies remaining part of the South Korea-China relationship. But the underlying premise that has to be fulfilled for that to work, I think, is actually for South Korean cutting edge technology players to be allowed a level playing field and to be fully integrated into the US market. And the reason why that is important is because that's actually what the South Korean chaebol, the large companies, wanted from China, and it became very clear that they weren't going to get it. And so from a South Korean perspective, it means they tried to knock on the Chinese door. They didn't quite get what they wanted, but it is absolutely the case that there's a lot of sensitivity with regards to the IRA and other legal frameworks in the United States that signal any potential risks that South Korean firms are not going to be afforded the opportunity to integrate. And I think the really telling indicator as related to that shift, there are two of them. One is the shift in the overall proportion of US ROK trade compared to China ROK trade. It's shifting in the direction of the United States for the first time in like 30 years. And the other one is the significant amount of South Korean investment that is flowing into the United States from companies like Hyundai in the EV market. And, we see actually, the US, 15 years ago, China was the destination for South Korean investment. Now it's clearly the United States. And, I think that represents a prior bet. But we have to wait and see whether there's a return on that investment in terms of the bet that South Korea is making.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, added to the discussion between Won-jae and Scott, I want to mention the current Yoon Suk-yeol government North Korea policy. Yes, this trilateral cooperation in this space area, not just space, but in all security and economic areas, are significant. But if South Korea does not make an effort to engage North Korea, trying to bring North Korea to the negotiation table and reduce the security risk factor from North Korea, I think South Korean foreign policy will be in significant danger in the future, because without engaging North Korea, if South Korea continues to expand this trilateral cooperation, then it'll push North Korea too much to the China and Russian side to make North Korea a hub of this continental trilateral cooperation, which will be a very undesirable situation for the South Korean government. So I think Yoon Suk-yeol government, even though it tries to push this current trilateral cooperation, he must also find ways to engage North Korea to the negotiation table.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I'm just running through the chat. There is one question I think that's posed to me, and I think perhaps we can take this up because it also helps to bring in the bipolar space competition between the US and China. And the question is, what are the dimensions of the Sino-US space competition on which allied contributions, such as among the Artemis participants, would be tempted to defect or would be willing to also engage in cooperation with China? And I think that's a very wonderful, kind of very broad question. And I think as this panel and the symposium, the paper writers have sort of made clear, the context is very much dependent, not just in domestic politics in those countries, but also the domestic politics of the US. So in the context of whether or not Artemis Accord signers can actually sign up also with the with China, that is not something that is extraordinary when we think about the history of the International Space Station. After all, Russia has been an important partner of the space station and has been sort of engaged in that for a very long time. But just this morning, as you may have heard, South Africa has also signed up along with Venezuela and also Russia on the International Lunar Research Station project that is being led by China. And China is also going further in that it is, I believe, intending to create an organization that is, I think, going to be called the International Lunar Research Space Organization or something like that. And depending on whether you think the competition is just about the industrial innovations or about the foundational rules that are going to govern the relations in terms of those makers, that kind of rule-based, order-led kind of innovations that China might be doing might be something that would be of interest to everybody, so long as they're about safety, security, sustainability of space. So I think in that sense, it wouldn't be so much a defection as really a sort of a diffusion of some of the basic principles that we're actually seeing in the Artemis Accords. In terms of very specific things, I think there's a lot of up and coming spacefaring countries that are not so interested in positioning in the US-led or the China-led competition, but really sort of positioning to gain some sort of a niche in an industrial domain capacity, or they're trying to take advantage of the geographic location by offering places for ground stations that can also empower space activities. So I would say that those are some of the most promising things, little rovers, little things in the supply chains that can affect, broader things like a lunar lander that goes to space. I think countries may want to begin to position. But as these panelists, as all of you have reminded us, a lot depends on the domestic political stability of the countries that are concerned. If I may add, I think the same would also go for China. There are internal politics in China that may affect how China is actually behaving in the international system. That is as true for the US, it is true for China, it is certainly true for South Korea, as we have learned from this panel. So I think that space is very fluid. And what it also reminds us is that it's a very shaky kind of alliance if you're trying to just lead one side or the other. So in that sense, the strength of the main players, the US and China, become even more important, because it's not necessary for them to always concentrate on the capabilities that their allies can bring on board, but also to reinforce the capabilities that they have at home. And so how that competition is sort of going to play out with respect to China and the US is going to be central to the kinds of peaceful prospects that we can expect in the international relations of space in the years ahead. So those are just some of my thoughts about it, but I'm very happy to hear other people's ideas about, as Scott puts it, defection or, diffusion, or however we may think about aligning. Alignments do matter, but the question is, how stable are they given the domestic political uncertainties and all these things, given that every nation wants to be a space nation. So I think that that's where we are in terms of the IR of space. Any thoughts or comments about that? Or I guess one thing I might pose to the to my colleagues as well is, I think one of the assumptions that we are going with is that US, the Sino-US competition is here to stay. It's in the space domain and it's going to stay forward. And so to the extent that theoretically we think that bipolar systems are a little bit more stable in the space domain, extended to the space domain, we should expect more stability. Yet stability is not necessarily what we're seeing when we look at sort of what is happening in the space domain right now. What I would like to do in order to end this and sort of bring things back up to a general level, also weaving in what you think are final points about South Korea, do you think that this Sino-US competition is going to sort of continue to color the way that we think about peaceful prospects in the space domain, and also the kinds of challenges and opportunities is presenting for South Korea? So any last thoughts as we are going to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so? Christy, do you want to lead us off maybe?
Sure. I mean, this is such a big question. I guess I would just say, to address one small part of it, that I do think that Sino-U.S. competition is going to continue to be a major factor. But I would also point out something that you alluded to in your comments, which is that, you know, we've been focusing mostly on kind of a close cooperation among a few countries or the region even, but the interplay between the international and regional and domestic levels is really essential, because you know, how that competition shapes what goes on in space will be playing out in the terms of like rules and norms, as well as in, you know, joint projects, investment, industrial policy. So there are so many interlinking pieces here that, you know, it really depends how China and the U.S. decide to manifest that competition. I think will determine, you know, the opportunities and the challenges for the individual countries, and really shape that context. But I think that a lot of the things that we've been saying about domestic politics are going to be really key. And for example, if the U.S. chooses not to exercise as much leadership on the global level in terms of space, then that will definitely change the context of the choices for other countries that they're trying to navigate forward.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else wants to? Please, Tongfei. Yeah.
I think the Sino-American competition will continue, even though I think we have seen some indications that China's growth is slowing down significantly. And I think there's a word, demographic destiny. And when we look at the working age population, China will definitely have a lot of difficulty. So we may even need to start worrying about the decline of China and how that affects Chinese foreign policy incentives, because it may actually become more aggressive to grab the strategic opportunity because it becomes weaker later on. But when we think about the Cold War, the US-Soviet Cold War, in hindsight, we know how poor the Soviet Union was and how much the Soviet power was sort of just a facade, and they had so many problems. And yet the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union continued for decades.
Yes.
Long after the Soviet Union already had many serious economic problems. And people talk about the rise of China, but China has already risen. And I think given the really important position China already has, even if China starts to decline significantly, I don't see how the competition between the United States and China can disappear anytime soon. I mean, making predictions about this kind of thing is always risky, and who knows, maybe something maybe we have never thought about could happen, and China and the United States might join their hands, alien invasion, for example. But joke aside, I think in terms of realistic prospect, it's very hard to see the Sino-American competition going away anytime soon. And it is bad in some aspects, but when we think about some other things, for example, I think economic nationalism is a serious problem, for example, in the United States. And I think during the Cold War, the US-Soviet Cold War, economic nationalism of the United States was moderated because of the geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And maybe the competition between the United States and China can also have some positive influence on not just on military alliances, but also global economy and even humanitarian contributions from these major powers, because they want to look good to the global public. So I hope we will see this positive influence, not just negative ones we always talk about.
On that very balanced note, I want to thank all our symposium participants today with their very thoughtful presentations and their very thoughtful discussion. Let us also hope that the rise of South Korea brings positive and hopeful realities to the international relations of space in Asia and also beyond. With that, good night once again. Thank you to Sumi and the University of Hawaii at Hilo and to the Korea Foundation for hosting this particular symposium. Thank you everyone for joining us today.